Hi, everybody. This is the fourth lecture for Chapter 19, Revolutions in Politics, and this is going to be about the age of Napoleon Bonaparte in power in France and in Europe. So, first of all, before Napoleon took power in 1799, there were a few years after the Reign of Terror, after the radical government, but before Napoleon took power. And this moment between 1795 and 99 is called the moderate or conservative phase of the French Revolution. And the government that is in power at the time is called the Directory. This was a new constitutional system that was created very quickly after the end of the Reign of Terror, when more conservative and moderate leaders basically ended the terror, brought the radicals under control, and decided to create a new constitution very quickly to kind of scrape radical influence out of government. So new elections are held, a new government is elected, and it's much more moderate and conservative, and much more representative just of the middle class and the upper classes, rather than the lower classes. So, now once this new government is in power, there's de-radicalization very quickly. The Jacobin Club is shut down, voting rights were limited to mostly people of property toward the upper level of society, and the government was then going to be stocked with moderates, liberals, middle class, bourgeoisie, upper class royalists, people who actually wanted to bring back the monarchy. Whoa. So, there's also going to be actual mob violence against former radicals, though, called the White Terror, where it's never going to be sanctioned by the government, but it's going to happen. And radicals will start to kind of feel a backlash toward, the violence that they had supported under the radical government of Robespierre. So one important thing that happens here, this is when the metric system is adopted in France, the base 10 system for weights and measures. There's also going to be a quick Catholic revival. So people are allowed to go back to Catholic churches, Catholic priests are allowed to have services again, and you see very quickly the Catholic Church starts to reemerge as a major cultural force in France. Now, this government, though, very quickly lost, credibility, because voting rights were so limited after having been expanded earlier. You start to see that the lower classes start to become discontented again, and the limits on food prices are removed, so food prices start to rise again. You start to see inflation occurring, and there starts to be a sense that the people really lose faith in this government pretty quickly. And it's looked at as a government for the bourgeoisie and the upper classes, rather than for the people. So, there's also some corruption scandals that become really big, and more, the army emerges as the one institution in France that still has a lot of credibility. And for a few years during this time frame, the army's winning some really big battles and taking over more land and making it part of this new republican system. And as they go, they allow people in these countries to have elections and, create their own republican systems along the lines of the French Revolution. So the army has a lot of credibility, and dashing young heroic generals like Napoleon Bonaparte emerge as the most popular figures in France. Politicians, people are starting to lose faith in them, but the army is becoming the new sort of, go-to institution in France. And the Directory, increasingly they relied on the army to maintain power. So when there were some small uprisings in French cities, the army would be called in to put them down. When elections didn't go the way that this conservative government liked, they called in the army to support them when they overturned the results. And ultimately, by 1799, the situation was unsustainable. And one particular army leader, probably the single most famous and popular general in the French army, was Napoleon Bonaparte. He planned with the Abbé Sieyès, the great sort of revolutionary writer from way back in the States General, the beginning of the revolution, to take over the government, backed by the army. Now, Sieyès, he thought he was going to be the equal partner in this new system that was created, but he learned very quickly that Napoleon is not a man who is taking second place or sharing power with anybody. So, backed by the army, they basically established themselves as the consulate, the new executive branch of the government that has essentially dictatorial power, backed by the army. Napoleon, though, very quickly emerges as the real powerhouse, and he declares himself the first consul of the Republic. And the word consul is actually an old Roman title for people who were elected to be generals, the military leaders and political leaders of the Roman Republic, 2,000 years earlier. So he takes this title to represent this idea that he is now becoming the singular leader of the Republic. He's not going to try and make himself a king or an emperor yet. He's establishing himself simply as the first primary leader of the Republic. So, by 1799 then, France had taken over and established republican governments across most of Italy, in the Netherlands, and as they were absorbing more territory, it became clear that they were on their way to creating a sort of republican empire, and other countries in Europe were starting to gear up to go to war against them, to an even greater extent. So, Napoleon, though, was from the island of Corsica, which is off the coast of France and was actually not controlled by the French until the late 1700s, just prior to the French Revolution. When Napoleon was a small child, the French Royal Army invaded and took over the island of Corsica. His father, Carlo, and his mother, Letizia, were low-ranking nobles from Corsica. Carlo decided to support the French invasion because he thought, you know what, we're not going to stop them, and I might as well sort of use the connections I can build to get my son to France in order to work his way up through, the bigger, more prosperous society. So he was able to get Napoleon into military academies in France, which allowed him to rise very quickly through the army once the revolution began, and, commanders and aristocrats fled the country or left the army. That cleared space for guys like Napoleon, who were really too low ranking in society to ever sort of achieve the highest levels in the army. It gave him actually a chance to do so. So, now Corsica is a very sort of rustic place, the kind of place you might go to go on a romantic honeymoon or something. But this was a place that definitely was not big enough to, contain the ambitions of a guy like Napoleon. So, once he was in the army in the 1790s, he very quickly shot up through the ranks, known as a dashing, decisive commander, someone who really understood new tactics and, ways to use artillery effectively. And he made a name for himself with some really smashing victories in Italy. So once again, by 1800 then, France had grown to incorporate all of these republican territories that had been established under French military control. So, Napoleon, though, very quickly made peace with Europe. He basically wanted to tell the rest of Europe, listen, I'm in charge now, we are taking a break, we are going to settle down, we are going to consolidate, what we have. I promise, we will not continue this war effort. Now, other countries in Europe, they were willing to make peace in the moment because of the sort of momentum that the French had been building up, but they knew that down the road there was going to be some kind of showdown eventually. So, now once Napoleon's in power, though, and he makes peace, then he sets to work reforming French society. And right from the get-go, it's clear he's not going to be totally dictatorial, but he's also going to protect a lot of the changes that occurred during the revolution, especially when it came to helping the middle class and the bourgeoisie. So he does create a concordat, or he makes peace with the Catholic Church in 1801. So officially then, according to this concordat, the church is allowed to keep its position as an established church of the country of France, and it retains its position as a great sort of influence in French culture. So, and eventually Napoleon actually brings back the Christian calendar and allows all of the festivals and so on to happen again. So people are allowed to go back to church, priests are allowed to, take over their congregations again. The Pope is really super happy about this. The Pope, was really totally on board with what he was doing. Now, he does allow full religious toleration, though. So he makes it clear, we are allowing this traditional institution in French society to come back, but we are also going to still be moving forward. We are still going to be an enlightened society that keeps the revolutionary changes that occurred and keeps the equal rights and liberties that had been allowed by the revolution. So, he creates a whole new law code, the Napoleonic Civil Law Code. This guarantees equal rights before the law for all citizens. It guarantees fair taxation across all levels of society. It guarantees religious liberty. So most of the changes from the revolution that people in France really liked, he keeps them. He creates a modern public school system and university system called the lycée, which, once again is made available to all classes in society in order to make sure that France can harness the productive power of all of its people in order to get them educated and make France more dynamic and productive. He does put limits on food prices. This is something that the working poor, the urban working class, really love. So he's got kind of something for everybody going on here. He lowers taxes on farmers. So even though they have to take lower prices on the food that they're making and selling, the grain that they're selling, they're also going to be able to sort of keep more money on the back end. So he wants to make sure that everyone is a little bit more prosperous. He's kind of covering all of his bases here to get a very broad base of support. And finally, he takes the support he builds up over these few years and pushes as far as he can go. He basically he wants to be the emperor. So he calls for a plebiscite in 1804, a referendum, where he basically just proposes a question to the French people. Do you want me, Napoleon Bonaparte, to be the emperor of the French people and to have more executive power in my hands? And overwhelmingly, the people say, yes, you will be the emperor. Now, importantly, though, he calls himself the emperor of the French, not the emperor of France. This is a very important distinction. He's emperor of the French people. So he always kind of tries to play this game that he's not like a divinely ordained absolute monarch. He is a monarch who embodies the will of the French people, a monarch who embodies popular sovereignty and the nation of the French people. So he is someone who is very sort of modern in this regard, that he is incorporating these Enlightenment ideas even as he is establishing more and more royal power for himself. So here's a very famous painting of his coronation. There he is right in the middle with various dignitaries and high-ranking people around him. And the Pope is sitting right there at his coronation. Now, importantly though, Napoleon, he very famously took the crown out of the Pope's hand and put it on his own head. So no one besides himself was putting that crown on his head. And then the crown for his wife, Josephine, to be the empress, that was placed on her head directly by Napoleon. So, now, in 1804 then, France is no longer a republic, and instead it becomes the first French empire. Now, he was very big on this idea of careers open to talent, or a meritocracy, people who had merit ruling society. So once he creates this empire, and it's no longer a republic, he actually creates an imperial aristocracy, but he creates noble titles, like Duke and Count, but rather than being given to, aristocrats, people who just own land and have the title, he gives it to people who do some service, in the army or in the French government. He basically wants to make it clear that nobility and aristocracy and basically becoming an elite in the society is based on something you do that is good and productive. And being given one of these titles does not necessarily give you special privileges other than just prestige, the fact that you are now something greater than just the average person in society. So, now, in addition though to ensuring some rights and protecting some of the rights from the revolution, he does curtail some rights in some ways. So he does sort of backtrack a little bit. Number one, he finally outlaws guilds altogether. These old labor organizations from really the Middle Ages. There had been a sort of fight going on against guilds for some time because you had, you know, people like Colbert and all through the 1700s, government officials who wanted to limit the ability of guilds to restrict trade and production of goods and allow more production to happen for lower costs, incorporating more people. So guilds are gone. Labor unions are outlawed altogether. The media is going to be very heavily censored. So newspapers, book publishers, they really sort of have to go through the government. And Napoleon, he's not like bloodthirsty. He's not a butcher. He doesn't like, kill people or execute people who are critical of him. He simply just silences them and makes it impossible for them to really sort of gain an audience in society. And same thing here. He has a secret police force where people are, spying on each other in France, and criticism of Napoleon will get you not death, but basically just being shunned from public life. And it'll be difficult to really sort of advance in this new society. Now, women are also going to lose rights. So women had not been allowed to vote during the French Revolution, really at any point. But now women really become second-class citizens. They're stripped of most of their property owning rights. Educational opportunities are not really as available to them. It becomes much more difficult to get a divorce. So women are going to see their position kind of reduced. And this, once again, is kind of throwing a bone to more conservative elements within French society. So, we're going to stop there for the moment. You can pick this up in Lecture 2, where we'll talk about Napoleon's empire, its rise and its fall. Bye.